All right, good morning, everyone. Uh, Panel number 2, my name is Dallas Wright. I'm a research project manager here at N3. I'm really excited to begin this next panel. I'm joined by some really incredible speakers who sit at the intersection of research and street outreach practice. And so it's going to be hopefully a really engaging and interesting conversation around building the evidence base, right? As we've talked a lot about how street outreach in Chicago has continued to grow and mature and expand. And along with that growth and maturity and expansion has come new and really exciting opportunities for partnerships between research partners and outreach partners. So I have with me this morning, Vaughn Bryant from Metropolitan Peace Initiatives, Dr. Kathryn Bocanegra from University of Illinois, Chicago, and Dr. Joseph Guisti from Institute for Nonviolence, Chicago, INVC. And so with that really brief intro, I want to kind of just get started with a broad question and we'll kind of drill down from there. And so if each of you all can just kind of open up and kind of, from your vantage point, talk about what sort of value, what sort of value add could research offer outreach practitioners?
So on a broad level, I would say just it validates the work. I think it informs the work, it strengthens the work. I think it allows you to ask critical questions, often difficult questions. One of the things I typically say is that humans aren't robots. It's hard to make human behavior a science. So over time, you can see trends in how people operate and how certain sort of interventions can, create change or some sort of reaction. So I think from a broad perspective.
But building off of what Vaughn just said, I think research can also strengthen the profession. It can support street intervention work. A few weeks ago, I was at the American Society of Criminology conference here, and I heard somebody use a term that I really appreciated, in that sometimes research is me-search, and that people often who come to violence prevention, violence reduction, criminal legal justice research, that it comes from an experience of being involved or personally impacted in that field. And I can definitely say, as a practitioner for more than 17 years in Chicago and in the areas of violence reduction and criminal legal reform, that I think there's more of a need as well for practitioners to move into research roles and vice versa, which I know that Dr. Joseph will talk about, because I think that lends an additional depth of knowledge and insights into how research can be done in ways that is equitable and empowering of street intervention workers.
Mm-hmm. And I would say the best resource that researchers can offer us is just the time and capacity and mental space. As people who are building bridges while we're walking across them, we never have enough time, we never have enough space. As Kathryn mentioned, I come from the world of academia, but now I'm a data monkey for INVC, and my time is spent fixing things in the database and doing stuff for our staff, and I just do not have the time to do things like the views study, which was so important, those reflexive projects, thinking, sort of getting outside of ourselves a little bit and looking at ourselves from an outside lens and asking those questions like, well, what are outreach workers really going through? How many of them are currently experiencing poverty? How many of them are currently experiencing homelessness? These are incredibly important questions. And research also offers us a new way to visualize the work. I mean, Andy's finding in 2013 that 70% of non-fatal shootings happen within co-arrest networks that comprise 6% of our city's population. That's huge. 70% of the shootings happen among people who know each other and who know our outreach workers. That's a huge finding, and anything like that can help us revisualize the work or turn it around and see it from a different angle is always needed.
Thank you. Yeah, you actually led right into my next question really beautifully. I was gonna ask you all, given your breadth of experience and expertise, what have been some of the most impactful or insightful findings that you've come across in over the course of your work in partnership with research? You want to start?
I mean, it really has been that one. That changed my thinking around research. And I'm actually a teacher here at Northwestern. I teach in the same building, on the same floor. I teach in 406 on Saturdays. And my students are non-traditional students who are mid-career, who are getting their bachelor's from Northwestern because they didn't do so earlier in their lives. And so I work with people who are in the workforce in Chicago. They think about Chicago. They love Chicago. And many of them, some have access to the communities where we work. Many don't. And that's mind blowing for them. So sometimes a simple finding like that, 70% of nonviolent shootings happen amongst people that know each other. Like, that's huge and really kind of shifts the lens.
Sure, I can provide a little bit of a story that leads into some of the research that I'm doing and the findings that I think it offers to the field. In March 2012, I was working at Enlace, and it was an unusually warm week, and there was a spree of shootings that resulted in the loss of 3 lives. And in one of those shootings, one of our outreach workers lost a participant. In fact, she arrived at the scene shortly after the shooting occurred and watched her participant bleed out on a couch and accompanied the family to the emergency room. And following that incident, this outreach worker quickly unraveled. She experienced secondary trauma. She fell back into some unhealthy habits. And because she was unable to keep up with her work responsibilities, we as an organization let her go because we said, you're not producing. And that instance has stuck with me for now 9 years. And I've seen that repeated over and over again over the time that I worked at Enlace and in consultation with some other nonprofits. So I thought a lot about what can organizations do in acknowledgement of the multiple forms of trauma exposure that take place over the course of street intervention work to protect their primary investment and tool, which is their workers. What can we do to better support workers? So a year ago, we started doing interviews, in-depth interviews with the street intervention workers and their supervisors, asking these questions. What kinds of trauma do you experience in the work? What was helpful at that time or what was not helpful at that time? And what can organizations, community-based nonprofits, do better for their street intervention workers? And so as somebody coming from outside the world of street intervention, we may think that the exposure to shootings and homicides is the most impactful or traumatic experience in this level of work, which it certainly is traumatic, okay? But what we heard overwhelmingly from the analysis of these interviews that we did was that actually the most traumatic element of the work was their treatment within organizations, okay? And I can spell that out a little bit further. Secondary to that was their interactions with criminal legal actors, with law enforcement, probation, parole, going to court hearings, and then secondary institutions like people who hold public benefits, driver's license offices, the DMVs, when people with street experience and perhaps criminal histories have to interface with these institutions on behalf of their clients or they themselves as street intervention workers. And then third to that was the exposure to violence within their communities. So what does that mean? It means that there's a huge opportunity for nonprofit organizations to play a role in supporting their workers and mitigating some of that traumatic stress. So to now come to your question, stemming from that experience 9 years ago to now, I think, through a lot of the excellent work that MFS has done with the Peace Academy, through the interviews that we're doing, through models of street intervention in Chicago, we're better understanding, rather than putting the onus on the individual to figure out your own issues, go find mental health treatment. There's a lot of time what we tell intervention workers, there's things that you can do as a team and as an organization to better support street intervention work, which builds community capacity for public safety.
Yeah, and I think the most important finding, I think, is kind of twofold for me. It's the validation that consistent relationships is one of the critical components to overcoming trauma. But I also think that the time it takes for us to gain the trust and get our participants to take advantage of resources available to them is the other finding that I think is critically important, because part of the way we built this and the way the sector has evolved was from intervening on shootings and killings not being enough. It's you have to intervene with the participants, put them on a path to a dignified life so that they're not back in the street doing the same thing, right? But the trajectory or the trust that needs to be built and the way you need to feel and the confidence you need to have to actually take advantage of the resources to get in the system and navigate it, that's a really, really difficult thing. And then I think the other thing is, how do we, to validate Kathryn's point, is how do we help the helpers? Because they have to have the ability to help themselves, and the better they help themselves, the better they can be of service to our participants. So all of those things have to work hand in hand. So from the place I sit, I started to work really thinking about how do we support community-based organizations. But I think the part that we have to be mindful of is, we're running a workforce program. Part of what they talked about earlier is how often this is, people's first job,
Yeah.
which means that there's a lot of professional development even beyond the Peace Academy that has to be done. Even to the point earlier, somebody talked about, raising salaries, life insurance. A lot of these organizations, they provide benefits and life insurance, and guys don't even know it, partly because it's their first job and maybe they go through an orientation and it doesn't stick and they don't really realize all that they have available to them. And that's part of our work.
Yeah. And I heard the word relationships come up a lot, and we use the word, or I use this word, partnerships, very intentionally, right? And so can you all kind of talk about, in your opinion, at what point or when is that community or outreach and research partnership at its best? What does that look like?
For me, it's when there's a trusting relationship. I don't think that either can be maximized unless there's trust going both ways. Because at the end of the day, having worked in multiple sectors, I've worked in government, I understand the burden of being able to justify the investments you make in this work. So with that, you need information. And so in an ideal world, you would be able to know the names of the people, where they live, who they hang out with, and be open about that. And that way we can target the people we need to target and go get the work done and track them. But we know it doesn't work that way because of a lack of trust and because of, certain things about our history that make us sub-optimized to a certain extent that doesn't allow for the perfect marriage. But I think the more we can build trust, the more we can, get real work done.
So in the research community, there's this research guide published by Chicago Beyond called Why Am I Always Being Researched? It's like a Bible for Chicago-based researchers or people who care about some level of community accountability. So that report is prefaced with, if we care about evidence-based, we should care about how it's made. And then I always add the next phase, and who makes it. And I believe having research collaborations with people who are embedded within communities, who are accountable to communities, who have practice insights and lived experiences is super important. And to that point, I think a functional collaboration that has trust involved is that what is the accountability mechanism for the institution of higher education, right? We can form our grand opinions based on reading transcripts or crunching data with no accountability or feedback from community. And so I think it's really important to have reflexive, iterative processes built into research. In the research that I've done, not only within street intervention research, we had community feedback sessions. After we did the research, then we sat down with community partners and asked them, here's what we're learning. What is your feedback on this? How should we interpret this? And then I also encourage having some kind of like advisory councils over research initiatives in which they're informing the development of research tools and providing feedback on the analysis in ways that is useful to community. Otherwise, again, our ideas are just kind of circulating within ivy towers with no accountability or impact to the communities that are most harmed.
Absolutely, to everything that's been said so far. And to put that stuff in maybe a different light, I think we kind of just need to call a spade a spade. There's a real difference in cultures between researchers and practitioners. Very different worlds, different languages, different timescales. There's no substitute for simply spending time with one another. We need to do it a lot more, in my opinion. This can be a glacial paced field in some ways. We work obviously, we work in a high risk, high stakes, low trust environment. So we have to think extra hard and intentionally about breaking through those barriers. Just to offer a snapshot of what this work can be like, I've been around INVC. I started working around INVC in 2016 as a researcher for UFC crime labs, and then I came on the team officially in 2019. So I've been around INVC since 2016. I only know the names of like a couple gangs in our 3 target areas just because they come up a lot. Right? Because there's certain things I still don't have access to and may never have access to for safety reasons, right? Stuff is very high stakes, like I can't say it enough. And so just simply spending time with one another to get used to each other and how we talk and how we think and how we feel and what kind of ticks us off and what keeps us going and what keeps us excited. I know one of the most productive things, I glowingly talk about it to anyone who will listen, is over the last, Andy, help me out. How long have we been doing the Tuesday sessions? 6 months, 5, 6 months, something like that? Every Tuesday, the N3 team comes to our West Garfield Park office and they help us figure out shootings that we don't know where it's coming from, right? So we have a lot of shootings in our target areas where we don't know who the aggressor is. Sometimes we don't even know who the victim is, right? There's just like these people that show up on our doorstep and we're like, how do we help them? And how N3 has been really helpful is they have these two very kind of simple data sets, right? Who's been arrested together and who's been shot. And when you put those two over one another, you can kind of see the relationship between these people and who gets shot. And so on these Tuesday sessions, we hang out and we just say, okay, tell us about this guy. Where does he come from? And then Angie or Jess will run something in R and they'll pop out this, oh, this is where all these people have been arrested and this is where all their associates have been arrested. That's huge. Just being able to have that little bit of information. And again, just spend the time in that process to kind of talk with one another and joke and sit around and have side conversations. Absolutely invaluable.
I have a comment and a question
definitely.
for you. So
Okay.
I think when I reflect on Andy's first meeting with CP4P, it reminds me of, the point I made about trust and, people weren't sold and, he was really hazed in that first meeting. We were actually at a retreat and I think it took some months, maybe even a year to really figure out, how we were going to do this work. And so I think my question for you, if you have insight on this, is how do you think sort of the coalition and the voice that represents the community has made you guys' work better?
That's a great question. So I think on the first hand is giving us, so the point about time, right? Relationships take time.
Yeah.
And a mistake that I've seen on the research side sometimes is that we come in and say, we have 3 years on this evaluation, we have to get it done this time, boom. And that's not how relationships necessarily are built, right? And so I think with the CP4P example in particular, understanding the balance between, okay, this takes time, but also there's urgency here, right? And not an urgency in terms of a self-serving urgency. I think it's giving the benefit of the doubt. That goes back to trust, right? And so it's I think with CP4 we've done a great job, and I've really been happy to be a part of that, walking that balance between earning trust, but also kind of giving the benefit of the doubt and saying, we want to help. If that makes sense, a great question. And to continue kind of on this thread, I think in each of your own ways, you all kind of touched on an elephant in the room a little bit, just that the history of how research in this field, in this city in particular, has been done, has not always been dignified, healthy, productive even. And so I think carrying that history with us, right, into this current setting and this time, and given you all's kind of long tenures in this work, how have you kind of navigated those scenarios, whether as a researcher or as someone who kind of bridges that gap between research and practitioners?
Yeah, I think that the point you made about practitioners and researchers being, having different sort of interests in a lot of ways is kind of how I come at it. My first interaction with researchers was really when I was at CPS and building the Safe Passage program. They wanted to do an RCT on that, and so if you guys remember, I forget the kid's name who was killed at
Darren Albert
at Finger, that sort of pushed that into being. And so my responsibility was building the Safe Passage program, and because of the pressures I had, I'm like, I'm not going to sacrifice one of our schools to risk a kid getting shot because we want to do research on something that we kind of already know. If we create a safer environment, then we're going to save these kids' lives. And so it's having the agency is kind of how I've looked at it. Like, you can't tell me what to do. I have just as much education as you. I can speak your language, and this is what we're going to do. And so we can negotiate, on equal footing, versus sometimes you may interact and you may not feel the power that you have or be able to exercise that power. And I think, our coalition, sort of helps that. So from my perspective, it's just understanding that you're on equal footing and getting the right thing done for the right reasons.
Yeah, I think you have the point you made, Vaughn, about like who's willing to roll up their sleeves and like really kind of put in the effort to take the time to build relationships. Even if you're Chicagoan, even with a practice background, it doesn't give you like automatic legitimacy in this field.
Yeah.
And it's sitting with a lot of uncomfortable conversations around like how you're going about your work. Just to give an example, on a separate project related to homicides in Chicago, I have this survivor advisory council that's overseeing research activities. So these are families of homicide victims who are helping inform how we talk with families, how we talk with homicide detectives. And I asked them like, how should we approach our interviews with detectives? How are we going to approach interviews with families? And one of the mothers on the council is like, it's so great that you want to get their stories, but like, then what are you going to do? You're going to leave them with this wide open gaping wound, and then you're going to go do your research. So like, what are you going to do? Mm-hmm. And if I was thinking, like a research role with a capital R, it's like, I would provide a sheet of referrals that are free and low of cost that could be accessed by a variety of insurance statuses. But that's, I would say, like unethical at the very level. And, I think that was reflected in the earlier panels, like people took time to recover even from survey questions, so imagine an in-depth interview, like what people go through in that space. So I think that's a challenge to people in research institutions and institutions of higher education, is that like, so what are you going to do with that knowledge isn't valued the same way as a peer-reviewed paper and getting federal grants. And that we're really supposed to stay in these kind of like narrow lanes of research roles, and that there are very few dual appointments. When I say dual appointments, it's actually encouraging people in research roles to actually give to the community and practice within the community. That's not valued. I think medicine and psychiatry are two areas that allow for that, but not social work, not sociology, rare, maybe sometimes in law. I don't know, Julie, if she's still here, she could contradict me. But that's not valued. And so in some ways, if we're in research positions in this field, I think we need to challenge the institutions that we're embedded within to carve out that practice and that community accountability pathway within the community we work in.
Let me just respond a little bit to you, but I would argue that that's part of the agency part. So like, for example, you guys have done a lot of research on the outreach community. It's not really your job to figure out what to do with the information. That's our job. Like, you guys have given us a level of information that we can then go turn around and do something with, like whether it's higher pay or, helping people understand their benefits, creating an employee assistance program for the outreach network to make sure that we're taking care of the helpers. Those are the type of things we have to do. Like, and I don't necessarily know that we always know that we can actually just do it, and that we don't have to ask for permission for certain things, and that we have to lean back on the people who did the research. Like, I think that's they give us the information, and then we work to make it actionable on our side. So
yeah.
When there's a Vaughn Bryant on the other end. But when you're working, like, a lot of supports for homicide victims in Chicago are grassroots informal organizations run out of church basements.
Yeah, no,
I wish I had you in that room, because you could be like, I can take this and run with it.
Yeah.
But in other places, you're working with disempowered, hurting people, and to be like, and here's your knowledge, go make it work, So it's like, I wish I had, you in that space.
Yeah. Joseph?
Yeah, I think in my experience, what I've seen so far, and I want to underline first that I'm really new at this. I'm still kind of like getting my land legs. But what seems to work the best that I've seen are two things. Number one, clarity, and two, the people that are more on the sort of research side, getting out of the way and becoming invisible as much as possible when appropriate. So the clarity piece, as we've already mentioned, there's two different cultures. There's research culture and outreach culture. And in my experience, my outreach coworkers and other frontline staff are thinking immediately and critically about what's in it for the researchers. Why are you here? What are you going to do with this? So you're going to get your publication, sort of like what Kathryn was saying, you're going to get your publication, you're going to leave, and then what do we do? So being very clear with people up front about why are people here? What are we wanting to find out? What are we not wanting to find out? Because that's a big challenge. Immediately, people are like, you're going to come in and you're going to know our participants' names so that you can tell them to the police and everyone can get arrested, right? That's like the immediate fear. Or give them to the ops and someone's going to get hurt, right? Or somehow this stuff is going to get out. So we need to be really clear about what we're not gathering data on, what we are gathering data on, and then sort of what the system of exchange is going to be. So the reason these Tuesday afternoon sessions with Angie and Jess and Andy's shop are working so well is because it became really clear quickly to the outreach staff that were kind of tasked with helming this project and making it work. Northwestern is giving us stuff. They're not asking us for stuff. They're showing us where incidents are coming from that we can't get a handle on. And as soon as that became clear to everyone involved that this is benefiting us, full stop, people were a lot more open to it. Now, is every project going to be able to sort of like asymmetrically benefit outreach workers to the exclusion of everybody else all the time? Of course not, right? Like everyone has their own stakes and needs, but to whatever extent we can really show people clearly, this is what's in it for you. And this is sort of the timeline for what can change. This gets really sticky, right? So I've already had 2 people make comments. We did that views survey, but we're still getting paid the same thing, right? So part of it is like communicating to the time scale of research and sort of the abstract and diffuseness of research, which can be really hard to communicate sometimes. And then the second thing that I see working really well is when we get out of the way. And from this, I can just share my own experience. I was trained as an academic, and as academics, we're taught to be our own product that we sell, and we're taught to be experts, and we're taught to sound smart and stand at the front of a room and tell people how they should think. And that's not going to work, right? In this sort of project. As much as I want to be the expert and tell people how I think things are going to play out, I really, from a minute-to-minute basis, have to just sit on my hands and get my ego in check and shut up and let people be experts because they are. Right? They're not trained in how to ask or answer questions in the way that I am, but they do have the answers. And getting there takes patience and humility.
Yeah, it's to kind of call back to that previous panel. It's almost like researchers need to build out some LTO of their own, right? And or consider that when they're doing their work, right? I want to slightly pivot to something, Vaughn, you mentioned really early on in the panel about people are not robots, right? And there are many things that can be measured, should be measured, are useful, but there's also maybe even many more things that are very difficult to measure, whether just in terms of like wrangling what this means or the difficulty of broaching that sort of subject with folks in the community. And so it's kind of a 2-part question, but one, I think, can you all speak to the importance of kind of delving into some of those fuzzier or less clear-cut sort of topics? And then 2, how have you all kind of done that in the past? What sort of best practices?
Could you repeat that one more time? I'm so sorry. I just want to make sure I get the first part all the way.
Yeah, no problem.
Give us an example of a fuzzy topic.
Yeah.
So like with the views survey, for example, we're quantifying like the exposure to violence on the street, whether personal life, professional life. But that almost kind of begs the question, well, then how is this impacting these folks when they're at their job, right? And that's not something that was within the scope of that survey, but it maybe something that should be focused on down the line. And so those types of things where you're talking about more maybe experiential sort of aspects of the research.
Yeah, so it just sort of reminds me of in the last panel, they talked about age and how the outreach workers are 44. And I think conceptually, the way I look at it is you have to start by building an alliance. So how, like, that's kind of a clinical term for like when you sit down as a therapist with a client, how do you actually join with them and how do you sort of find some common ground for the actual, work or questions that you want to answer? And I think that's part of the point, is that you gotta like understand, what am I trying to get out of this? What am I helping you get out of that? And that, to me, if you have built an alliance, then that creates the conditions for really going deep. And I think the other thing is that, and this is where I think lived experience and having researchers that, sort of understand the community is use of self. Like sometimes you have to be able to say, here's my experience on a particular thing, which then maybe creates a little more safety for, the person who's being asked the questions to feel safe actually giving those answers. And so, there's a lot of different, tools you can use, but those are kind of the things that immediately come to mind when it comes to deeper and deeper topics, which again, I want to just emphasize this too. as an outreach worker or a researcher, when you're going into that depth, part of that is it's hard to go deep with somebody when you don't do it for yourself. And so it's got to be a two-way street on that, as opposed to, sort of being an observer and, sort of taking advantage of somebody else's vulnerability. Like that's tough.
Yeah, this is a great question. So I would say research on trauma is like all grayish. And I want to give a lot of credit to Kelly Carroll in the back about like how she's kind of advanced my thinking about this. So in one of our interviews, these were again interviews, not surveys. We asked about trauma, and one of our study participants like held up a piece of paper and poked a small hole in it, and he's like, "All of this is my traumatic experience." So when you ask me a question, a yes or no question, it's like, is it this, like this small little piece of this larger experience? And so that was the reason why we chose to use a qualitative approach for understanding trauma. So because we wondered if the experiences of street intervention workers and their level of trauma exposure is fitting within existing diagnostic categories of trauma. And even if those diagnostic categories reflect how street intervention workers describe trauma themselves, okay? And so to that point, trauma is like a very it's a popular term right now. It can mean everything and nothing at the same time. And so the research that we've done has tried to kind of release ourselves a little bit from these kind of narrow ways of defining trauma, really hearing the participants and how they describe traumatic experience and its impact on them, like how they respond to trauma. And then to think about what are practices based on their experiences, rather than this evidence-based practice works, this scale works, this validated survey works. Like those are all really important tools, but if I think we're trying to think about organizational practice through multiple dimensions, then we need a more robust understanding of what trauma is. So to your last point, when we presented some of this research at the American Society of Criminology, one of our attendees in the session was like, "No, I need to know what is trauma and what is not." Like there needs to be really clear-cut categories, almost like a menu of trauma. And if you're not on that menu, then your experiences aren't traumatic. And we had to be like, it doesn't work that way, And this is somebody who is a very prolific, scholar and activist in this space. And so I think the conversations we're having around trauma and street intervention work have so much more development, and we need to kind of be willing to be in a little bit of a gray zone and be understanding of the inexact, I don't know if I'm saying that word correctly, like nature of this to actually do better for the field.
Let me give you an example, sort of what Kathryn is talking about. I have to give a shout out to Dominique McCord, our Director of Behavioral Health Services. So she's, from East Garfield Park, went to Northwestern, went to SSA, 15 to 20 years in the mental health profession. One of the things that she thought was really important is for us to, take the, sort of trauma-informed care, sort of that we talk about, kind of thinking about it, as a buzzword, and really make it practical to outreach. And so each of the CP4P partners sent 2 people to what we call a trauma-informed care training, where they would get trained to be trainers to take back to their organizations. And so, we talk about trauma-informed care, but we have to create trauma-informed organizations, which means everybody at the organization has to practically know what it means and how trauma manifests itself in behavior and those sort of things. So when you have, a well-versed workforce in, trauma-informed care, then it makes it a lot more tangible and real, and it's less of a buzzword, and you actually know what to do with the actual information you have. And so, and it's hard to do that without the coalition we have, because we can lean on the expertise of not only my team, but everybody within the coalition has somebody, whether it's Jackie at Enlace or, whoever, helping us build those type of things that ultimately benefit the whole coalition and really benefit the whole field.
Yeah, it feels like we're really at a special point right now as we're thinking about developing a profession where we have a chance to think intentionally and critically about how to really build out a trauma-informed profession. As Kathryn said, trauma is a buzzword. Everyone mentions it. We all know that we should be trauma-informed. We all repeat that we should be trauma-informed. But what exactly does that look like? The comment that someone asked about what is trauma and what isn't trauma, and give me the menu so if I know I'm on it. Oh, this is such a gigantic and complicated topic. My first year at INVC, I would talk to my friends and family. We all do. We kind of let off our work stress, and I'd be like, man, it's just, people may have never had a chance to get tech skills. Maybe they were in jail this whole time and they never used a smartphone, and maybe they're dealing with their friends getting shot on a regular basis. And now I just kind of lump all that into this one trauma city. The organization I work for is Trauma City. All of us are I'm traumatized. I lost a coworker this year. I had another coworker get shot in the face last month. Like, we are all traumatized, right? And we need to, we can continue to work smart, not hard, to avoid some of the things that sort of maybe got us into this position to begin with in other industries, right? I'm looking at the staff I work with, and I'm thinking to myself, how many times, because let me back up a little bit. Conversations are hard in this field, right? Talking to staff is hard in this field. Everyone's crispy. Everyone's dealing with a lot. Everyone's underslept. And oftentimes, a conversation that I think is going to go real smooth, like, hey, I just need this thing. Could you get this to me? I met with someone who's upset. That's trauma, right? I have to stop and think, in what ways am I triggering someone because I'm reminding them of a situation in which someone who looked like me was telling them that they were fundamentally broken? How can I stop that in its tracks right now before we continue this conversation? I don't know. I might be getting a little outside of the realm of like applied research right now. But if that's not one of the toughest, most important questions in the room, I don't know what is. How do we work in this environment in a productive way that doesn't repeat the mistakes of Chicago work life, in which class inequality is threaded through this city of broad shoulders in so many ways? How do we not do that again?
Yeah, I would just say, I think to your point, I think we are leading the way and creating a more trauma-informed city in that way. Because everything that we talk about, whether we're doing it through a chick training or we give that information to Vanessa and then they train the facilitators, and then all of our guys who are coming through the Peace Academy get it in a good, real way. That's part of it. Or even, things that come from, our MPA participants, where they're like, we are talking about self-care and professionalism, for example. And then we have to go back to the organization and say, hey, like, don't tell your guys to take care of themselves when you as an organization don't allow for that to happen, which means you have to create the conditions for self-care. So there can be a two-way street on that. But if we all sort of really fundamentally understand the trauma lens, then we can hold each other accountable to what that looks like.
And I know we landed in a really good spot, but I want to really, really quickly, if we can, just have to close out, Joseph, you kind of, I think, accurately described what we all kind of maybe recognize, is just that the field itself, and then even research and outreach partnerships, are kind of, I wouldn't say crossroads necessarily, or from my, but it's like, I look at it as kind of like standing at the precipice of like a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of ways to go, right? Not necessarily just two. And so I think maybe to close out, can we just each maybe briefly touch on whether it's a research focus or a type of partnership, the nature of partnerships, where would you like to see these sorts of partnerships go in the future?
So I think one future from the street intervention research that we've done is like the need to develop more leaders in the street intervention field. Like there's I think the FLIP program and some other initiatives in Chicago have developed like a farm league, an intentional farm league for street intervention. But then once somebody's in the profession, like how do you intentionally develop them? One of our study participants said there's no off-ramp for street intervention. So you can get people who want to get out, who can't, because they feel like they have no other professional venues. And that's, again, where organizations really play a role. When someone is hired into street intervention work, they're usually told you are hired because you have a street cred and all these awful things that happen to you, and we're going to capitalize on that to reduce violence in our neighborhood. But they're rarely told you're more than the worst thing that's ever happened to you or that you've ever done. And we're going to build an identity around that as a peacemaker in our community. I think that is your path to leadership development, so that 5 years from now, when N3 has their next panel, like you have a whole new set of faces here reflecting the new leaders in the field. They're not people who've been maybe here too long. So yeah. I think that's an opportunity for new research and community partnerships.
I really don't have a answer for this question because I think we're moving in the right direction. And to me, I think as long as we can continue to build the trust and use the information for us to strengthen our work, like to me, that's the most important thing. And honestly, I hope that, 15, 20 years from now, we're not doing this. That's my wish.
I have a lot of ideas for applied research in the field, so many that I wrote them all down on a note card, but I'll save a lot of them for my one-on-one convos with the N3 team, and where we sit and we spin our wheels about how we need to operationalize variables differently, or think of different outcome measures, or get into the risk assessment stuff a little bit deeper. But I'll pick one of the things that I wrote down because I think it kind of fits the theme of everything we've been talking about, and that's this capacity building piece. I want to see the ranks of researchers swell and start to look differently. I've already told my boss that my next assistant at my job, I want to be one of our outreach workers. Like, I want to see our outreach workers get PhDs in sociology. It's not impossible, right? We need to swell the ranks, and we need to get them to look more diverse and not just in a tokeny kind of way. We need to give people real skills. And connected to that, I'm an educator. I teach non-traditional college students on Saturdays, but I'm not an education researcher, and we need more education research on our staff, on our human resources. When I work with my coworkers and teach them how to put their data in and teach them how to think about data, I'm working with a group of people who are very hungry for skills and knowledge, who want to learn. But there are significant barriers to learning. And a lot of times I go to try and look up education research that would help me get, a finger on, like, how do these learners learn best? Because this is a very non-traditional group of learners that we work with. How do these learners learn best? Has that question been posed in a systematic way? And how much progress have we made on that question? I'm not sure, but I see that as an opportunity for research.
Traumas related to that.
Of course.
So.
Yeah. Well, Joseph, Kathryn, Vaughn, thank you all so much for joining me on the stage today and joining us at this event.